Millionaire disguises himself as chauffeur to follow his girlfriend. What he discovers makes him cry. The sun rose over the skyscrapers of New York City, bathing the luxurious Thompson mansion in golden light. Inside, Alexander Thompson, heir to a business empire worth billions, watched the dawn from the balcony of his room. At 28 years old, he possessed everything anyone could desire: money, power, a promising career, and yet an inexplicable emptiness gnawed at him inside. Is this all there is to life? He wondered, running a hand through his perfectly styled black hair. His emerald green eyes reflected a mixture of melancholy and longing as he contemplated the city he would one day inherit. The sound of knuckles gently rapping on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," said Alexander, turning towards the entrance. George, the family's butler for decades, entered with a silver tray. "Good morning, young Mr. Thompson. Your breakfast is ready, and Mr. Robert is waiting for you in his office to discuss today's business." Alexander suppressed a sigh. Another day, the same routine. "Thank you, George. Tell my father I'll be there in a few minutes." When the butler withdrew, Alexander headed to his dressing room. As he put on a custom-tailored suit that cost more than many people's annual salary, he made a decision: he couldn't go on like this anymore. Half an hour later, he entered his father's imposing office. Robert Thompson, a 60-year-old man with graying hair and a penetrating gaze, looked up from the documents he was reviewing. "Alexander, you're finally here. We need to discuss the merger with Garcia Industries. It's an opportunity we can't pass up." Alexander sat down in front of the mahogany desk, gathering the courage for what he was about to say. "Father, before we talk business, there's something important I need to tell you." Robert frowned, noticing the seriousness in his son's tone. "What is it? Does it have to do with your engagement to Caroline? You know that the union of our families is crucial for—" "No, it's not about Caroline," Alexander interrupted. "It's about me, Father. I need time. Time to find myself, to discover what I really want in life." Robert's face hardened. "What are you talking about? You have everything you could want here. The company needs you to get more involved, not to distance yourself." Alexander stood up, his determination growing with every word. "I know, and I appreciate everything you've built, but I feel there's a whole world out there that I don't know. I want to travel, experience life outside these golden walls. It will only be for a few months." "A few months?" Robert rose, his voice rising. "Have you lost your mind? What about your responsibilities, your future?" "My future is precisely what I want to discover," Alexander replied calmly. "I've made my decision, Father. I'm going to Europe for a while. I need to do this." Robert stared at him, a mixture of disappointment and concern in his eyes. "And Caroline? What will you tell your fiancée?" Alexander felt a pang of guilt. Caroline, his best friend's cousin, was a charming young woman, but their engagement had been more of a family arrangement than a decision of, "Love, I'll talk to her. I'm sure she'll understand." As he left the office, leaving his father immersed in tense silence, Alexander couldn't imagine how this trip would change his life forever. 2 weeks later, Alexander found himself at the airport, suitcase in hand, ready to board a flight to Paris. Beside him, Caroline looked at him with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "I'm going to miss you," she said, adjusting the pearl necklace Alexander had given her on their last anniversary. Alexander hugged her, feeling a wave of affection for her. "I'll miss you too, thank you for understanding." Caroline pulled away, her blue eyes shining with unshed tears. "Just promise me you'll come back, that you won't forget me." "I could never forget you," he replied, kissing her forehead. "I'll be back before you know it." With one last look, Alexander headed towards the boarding gate. As he walked, he couldn't help but feel a mixture of excitement and apprehension. He was leaving behind everything he knew, but his heart beat with the promise of new experiences. What Alexander didn't know was that fate had surprises in store for him that would change the course of his life. Forever months passed, and Alexander traveled through Europe with a backpack and a heart open to new experiences. From the cobblestone streets of Paris to the beaches of the Amalfi Coast, each day brought new adventures and perspectives. One afternoon, while enjoying a coffee in a small square in Rome, his phone rang. It was his best friend, Matt. "Alexander, you need to come back." Matt's voice sounded broken. "It's Caroline, she's passed away." The world seemed to stop. Alexander felt as if the ground was opening up beneath his feet. "What? How is that possible?" He managed to articulate. "It was her heart," Matt explained between sobs. "A condition no one knew about. It happened so fast." Alexander closed his eyes, overwhelmed by guilt and pain. At that moment he knew his journey of self-discovery had come to an end. It was time to return home and face the consequences of his departure. The return to the Thompson mansion was somber. Caroline's funeral gathered the high society, but Alexander barely registered the condolences and looks of pity. His mind was elsewhere, remembering the moments shared with Caroline, wondering if things would have been different if he had been there. Weeks after the funeral, Alexander found himself immersed in work, trying to fill the void he felt. One afternoon, he decided to escape the stifling atmosphere of the office and entered a small cafe in the city center. It was there that he saw her for the first time. She was behind the counter, her brown hair tied in a messy ponytail, her honey-colored eyes shining as she smiled at a customer. There was something about her presence that immediately caught Alexander's attention. "Welcome," she said when Alexander approached the counter. "What can I get you?" Her voice was warm with a slight accent that Alexander couldn't place. "A black coffee, please," he replied, surprised by the sudden nervousness he felt. "Coming right up." She smiled, and Alexander noticed that her name tag said Sophie. As he waited for his coffee, Alexander couldn't help but observe her. There was a natural grace in her movements, a refreshing simplicity that contrasted with the world of luxury and pretension he was used to. When Sophie handed him his coffee, their fingers brushed for an instant. It was a fleeting moment, but Alexander felt a spark, a connection he hadn't experienced before. "Thank you," he said, meeting her gaze. "I'm Alexander, by the way." "Nice to meet you, Alexander," Sophie replied, her smile lighting up her entire face. "I hope you enjoy your coffee." As he sat at a nearby table, Alexander knew he would return to this cafe, not just for the coffee, but for the intriguing waitress who, unknowingly, had just planted a seed of hope in his wounded heart. What Alexander couldn't imagine was that this casual encounter would be the beginning of a story of love, betrayal, and redemption that would test everything he thought he knew about himself and about love. Days turned into weeks, and Alexander found himself more and more often at the small cafe where Sophie worked. Each visit revealed a new facet of the young waitress that intrigued him more and more. One evening, as Sophie was cleaning the tables after closing, Alexander gathered his courage. "Sophie," he began, his heart beating hard, "I was wondering if you'd like to have dinner with me tomorrow night." She looked at him surprised, a slight blush tinting her cheeks. "Alexander, you're very kind, but I don't think it's a good idea. We're from different worlds." "How do you know?" he asked, intrigued by her response. Sophie smiled sadly. "The suits you wear cost more than my monthly salary, and I've seen the society magazines. I know who you are, Alexander Thompson." Alexander was speechless for a moment. "I didn't know you had recognized me, but that doesn't matter, Sophie. I like you for who you are, not for your social status." She looked into his eyes, searching for sincerity in them. Finally, she sighed. "All right, one dinner, but nothing fancy, okay?" Alexander's smile lit up his entire face. "I promise I'll pick you up tomorrow at 8. The dinner was at a small Italian restaurant, away from the hustle and bustle of downtown. As the night progressed, Alexander found himself increasingly captivated by Sophie. Her laughter, her intelligence, the way her eyes shone when she talked about her dreams, everything about her attracted him like a magnet. "How did you end up working at the cafe?" Alexander asked as they shared a tiramisu. Sophie played with her fork, her expression becoming serious. "It's a long story. Let's just say life hasn't always been easy. I had to leave college to take care of my sick father. The cafe gave me the flexibility I needed. Alexander felt a pang of guilt as he thought about his own privileges. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to—" "Don't apologize," Sophie interrupted with a warm smile. "Everyone has their own path. Mine has made me who I am." At the end of the night, as they walked under the stars, Alexander stopped and looked at Sophie. Without thinking twice, he leaned in and kissed her, softly. To his relief and joy, she returned the kiss. When they separated, both smiled, aware that something special had begun. The following months were like a dream for Alexander. For the first time in his life, he felt he had found something real, something that couldn't be bought with money. Sophie challenged him, made him laugh, inspired him to be better. However, not everything was perfect. Robert Thompson observed his son's relationship with growing concern. "Alexander," he said one night during a family dinner, "I understand that you're in love, but have you thought about the future? This girl, Sophie, does she really fit into our world?" Alexander put down his fork, annoyed. "Dad, Sophie is the best thing that's happened to me. I don't care if she fits into your definition of our world." "I'm just thinking about your well-being," Robert insisted. "What do you really know about her family, about her past?" His father's words, although he rejected them at the moment, planted a seed of doubt in Alexander's mind. Meanwhile, in an elegant office building on the other side of the city, a shadowy figure observed photographs of Alexander and Sophie together. "Are you sure it's her?" asked a deep voice. "Without a doubt, sir," replied a man dressed in black. "We've been following her since she began her relationship with young Thompson." The figure turned, revealing the face of Jack Sanders, the Thompsons' biggest business rival. "Excellent. It seems our little Sophie is doing an impeccable job. Soon we'll have all the information we need to destroy the Thompsons once and for all." What no one knew was that Sophie harbored her own secrets, secrets that would threaten to destroy not only her relationship with Alexander, but also the delicate balance of power in the city's business world. As their relationship deepened, Alexander decided to take the next step. One night, during a romantic dinner on the terrace of his penthouse, he knelt before Sophie. "Sophie," he said, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket, "these last few months have been the happiest of my life. You've shown me a world I didn't know existed. You've made me a better person. Would you do me the honor of marrying me?" Sophie gasped, her eyes filling with tears. For a moment, a shadow of doubt crossed her face, so quickly that Alexander barely noticed. "Yes," she finally whispered, a smile lighting up her face. "Yes, I'll marry you." As Alexander slipped the ring on her finger, Sophie hugged him tightly, hiding her face in his shoulder. What Alexander couldn't see was the expression of conflict in his now fiancée's eyes. That night, while Alexander slept, Sophie quietly got up from the bed. She took her phone and sent a cryptic message. "Phase 2, complete. Proceed as planned." The response came almost instantly. "Excellent work. Remember, there's no turning back now." Sophie looked at the sleeping Alexander, a mixture of guilt and determination on her face. "I'm sorry, my love," she whispered. "I wish things were different." As she returned to bed, Sophie couldn't imagine how her actions would trigger a series of events that would test her love, loyalty, and the true nature of everyone involved. The preparations for Alexander and Sophie's wedding were advancing at full speed. The city's high society was buzzing with rumors and speculations about the mysterious bride of the Thompson heir. Meanwhile, Alexander was immersing himself more and more in the family business, preparing to take on a more important role in the company. One afternoon, while reviewing some documents in his office, Alexander noticed something strange on his phone: deleted messages, calls to unknown numbers, and an encrypted messaging app he didn't remember installing. "What is this?" he muttered to himself, frowning. He tried to access the app, but it was password protected. Uneasiness began to grow inside him. Was someone using his phone without his knowledge? Or was it something more sinister? That night, during dinner with Sophie, Alexander couldn't help but observe her with new eyes. Was it possible that the woman he loved was hiding something from him? "Is everything okay, love?" Sophie asked, noticing his distraction. Alexander forced a smile. Yes, just tired from work. Sophie looked at him with concern. You should take a break. How about we go to the beach for the weekend? I'd love to, but I have an important meeting on Saturday, Alexander replied. Maybe next week. Sophie nodded, but Alexander noticed a flash of relief in her eyes. Doubts began to corrode Alexander's mind. He needed answers, but how to get them without risking his relationship if he was wrong? Days later, Alexander made a drastic decision. If he wanted to discover the truth, he would have to take extreme measures. In the garage of the Thompson mansion, Alexander looked at himself in the rearview mirror of one of the family cars. The man looking back at him was almost unrecognizable. Hair dyed grey, fake beard, thick-rimmed glasses, and a chauffeur's uniform. I hope this works, he muttered, adjusting his cap. That afternoon, he discreetly followed Sophie as she left the cafe where she worked. To his surprise, instead of heading to her apartment, Sophie took a taxi to an exclusive residential area of the city. Alexander followed her at a prudent distance, his heart pounding. He saw Sophie enter an imposing mansion and waited, watching hours passed. When Sophie finally came out, Alexander noticed she was carrying a thick envelope in her hand. Without thinking twice, he followed her back to the city. At a stoplight, Alexander stopped next to Sophie's taxi. For a moment, their gazes met. Alexander's heart stopped, fearing he would be discovered. But Sophie simply looked away, not recognizing him. That night, while Sophie slept, Alexander checked her purse. He found the envelope, and with trembling hands, he opened it. Inside were financial documents from Thompson Enterprises, confidential documents that shouldn't be in anyone's hands outside the company. It can't be, Alexander whispered, feeling as if the ground was opening up beneath his feet. The next morning, Alexander woke up early, his mind still reeling from the previous night's discovery. He decided to follow Sophie once more, hoping that everything was a misunderstanding. Again disguised as a chauffeur, he followed her to a park on the outskirts of the city. There, he saw Sophie meet with a man he immediately recognized, Jack Sanders, his father's biggest business rival. Hidden behind some bushes, Alexander watched in horror as Sophie handed another envelope to Sanders. He saw them talking animatedly, and for a moment he thought he saw Sanders caress Sophie's face in a too intimate manner. Alexander's world was crumbling around him. Had it all been a lie? Sophie's love, her promises, their future together? As he drove back to the city, tears of rage and pain blurred his vision. He was so distracted that he almost crashed into another vehicle. "Watch where you're going, idiot!" shouted the other driver. Alexander stopped abruptly. That voice, he would recognize it anywhere. It was Sophie. Their gazes met. Through the car windows this time, there was no disguise that could hide the truth. Sophie recognized him, and in her eyes, Alexander saw a mixture of shock, fear, and guilt. "Alexander?" Sophie whispered, her face paling. Without saying a word, Alexander started the car and drove away, leaving a stunned Sophie in the middle of traffic. That night in the Thompson mansion, the storm finally broke. "How could you?" Alexander shouted, throwing the documents on the table. "I trusted you, Sophie. I gave you my heart, my future." Sophie, with tears in her eyes, tried to approach him. "Alexander, please let me explain." "Explain what?" he interrupted, his voice broken with pain. "How you've been selling information about my family to our biggest rival? How our entire relationship has been a lie?" "No," Sophie exclaimed. "What I feel for you is real, Alexander. Yes, it started as a job, but I fell in love with you, really." Alexander looked at her, wanting to believe her, but unable to do so. "A job? For whom? For Sanders?" Sophie nodded, lowering her gaze. He has information about my father. Information that could destroy him. He blackmailed me into meeting you, getting close to you, and obtaining information about your company." "And the documents? The secret meetings?" Alexander pressed. "At first it was just small things. Sophie explained between sobs. But Sanders wanted more and more. I didn't know how to get out of this without endangering my father. Alexander collapsed into an armchair, overwhelmed by the revelations. Why didn't you tell me? We could have found a solution together. I was afraid, Sophie confessed. Afraid of losing you, of you not believing me. And then, when you proposed, I thought I could find a way to fix everything before the wedding. A heavy silence fell over the room. Alexander looked at the engagement ring on Sophie's finger, a painful reminder of the promises that now seemed so distant. I love you, Alexander, Sophie whispered. Please, give me a chance to prove it to you, to make things right. Alexander closed his eyes, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. When he opened them, his gaze was one of determination. If you really love me, he said slowly, then help me stop Sanders together. Sophie looked at him, surprised and hopeful. Do you mean it? Alexander nodded. But this is your last chance, Sophie. One more betrayal, and we're done forever. As they embraced, tears mingling, neither of them could imagine the dangers and challenges that awaited them. Trust was broken, but would their love be strong enough to overcome the trials that were to come? What they didn't know was that, hidden in the shadows of the garden, a figure had heard the entire conversation. Jack Sanders smiled maliciously as he walked away into the night. The game had only just begun, and he had an ace up his sleeve that neither Alexander nor Sophie could imagine. The morning after the confrontation, Alexander and Sophie sat on the terrace of the Thompson mansion, untouched cups of coffee in front of them. The silence between them was tense, filled with unresolved emotions and broken trust. So, Alexander began, his voice still hoarse from the night of arguing, where do we start? Sophie looked up, her eyes red from crying, I have an idea, but you're not going to like it. Alexander looked at her expectantly, bracing himself for the worst. We need to continue with Sanders' plan, Sophie said, her voice barely a whisper. At least in appearance, it's the only way to get evidence against him. Alexander stood up, pacing the terrace. Are you asking me to let you continue betraying my family? No, Sophie replied firmly. I'm asking you to trust me one last time. We can give him false information, lead him into a trap. After a long moment of consideration, Alexander slowly nodded. Okay, but this time we work together. No secrets. Sophie extended her hand, and Alexander took it, sealing their new pact. In the weeks that followed, Alexander and Sophie worked tirelessly on their plan. During the day, Alexander immersed himself in the company's business, pretending normalcy. At night, he and Sophie devised strategies, created false documents, and prepared the trap for Sanders. However, the tension between them was palpable. Every look, every touch was charged with doubts and unasked questions. Could they really overcome this betrayal? One night, while working on the fake documents, Sophie broke the silence. Alexander, there's something I need to tell you, she began, her voice trembling. He looked at her, feeling his heart race. What is it? Sophie took a deep breath. I'm pregnant. The world seemed to stop for Alexander. He looked at Sophie, a mixture of emotions crossing his face, surprise, joy, and then, inevitably, doubt. Is it? He began to ask, but stopped, unable to formulate the question. It's yours, Sophie affirmed, tears forming in her eyes. I swear on this baby's life, Alexander, there was never anyone else. Alexander moved closer to her, hugging her tightly. For a moment, all the doubts and pain vanished, replaced by a wave of love and protection towards Sophie and their unborn child. I believe you, he whispered, kissing her forehead, and I promise we'll solve this for us and for our baby. Meanwhile, in the offices of Sanders Incorporated, Jack Sanders was meeting with his legal team. Are you sure this will work? He asked, reviewing some documents. His lead lawyer nodded. Absolutely, sir. With the information we've obtained, we can force a hostile takeover. Thompson Enterprises will be ours in a matter of months. Sanders smiled maliciously. Excellent. And to think all this is thanks to our dear Sophie. Too bad she's no longer useful to us." "What should we do with her, sir?" asked one of his subordinates. "For now, nothing," Sanders replied. "Let her play happy couple a bit longer. Soon, both she and Alexander Thompson will learn that no one messes with Jack Sanders and gets away unscathed." As the day of the trap approached, Alexander and Sophie intensified their preparations. They had agreed to a meeting with Sanders in a safe house, supposedly, to deliver the last crucial documents. The night before the big day, Alexander found Sophie in the mansion's garden, looking at the stars. "Nervous?" he asked, sitting beside her. Sophie nodded. "Terrified, actually, Alexander, if something goes wrong tomorrow." "It won't," he interrupted her, taking her hand. "I'll be there, hidden at the first sign of danger. I'll intervene." Sophie looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I'm so sorry, Alexander, for everything. If I could go back..." "Shh," he calmed her, pulling her close. "We can't change the past, but we can build our future together." They kissed under the moonlight, a kiss laden with promises and hopes for tomorrow. The day of the trap arrived. Sophie entered the safe house, her heart pounding. Alexander was hidden in an adjoining room, ready to intervene if necessary. Jack Sanders arrived punctually, his predatory smile lighting up his face as he saw Sophie. "My dear Sophie," he greeted, kissing her hand. "Do you have what I asked for?" Sophie nodded, handing him an envelope. "Everything's here, Jack. The last details of Thompson Enterprises' secret merger." Sanders opened the envelope eagerly, reviewing the documents. His smile widened. "Perfect with this. The Thompsons are finished." "And my father?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. "Will you keep your end of the deal?" Sanders looked at her, a spark of cruelty in his eyes. "Oh, Sophie, so naive. Did you really believe I would let go of such valuable information?" Sophie's heart sank. "What do you mean?" "Your father, my dear, was never in danger," Sanders revealed with a cold laugh. "It was all a ruse to manipulate you, and it worked perfectly." Alexander, listening to everything from his hiding place, had to restrain himself from coming out and confronting Sanders right then. Sophie, however, maintained her composure. "And now what, Jack? Will you kill me?" "Kill? You?" Sanders laughed. "No, I have much better plans for you. You see, I need a wife to improve my public image, and you, my dear Sophie, are perfect for the role. I will never marry you," Sophie spat. "Oh, you will," Sanders threatened, approaching dangerously, "unless you want something terrible to happen to your beloved Alexander or that bastard you're carrying in your womb." Sophie's eyes widened in horror. "How?" "I have eyes and ears everywhere, darling," Sanders smiled. "Now, be a good girl," and he couldn't finish the sentence. Suddenly, the door burst open and Alexander entered, followed by a team of police officers. "It's over, Sanders," Alexander declared. "We have everything recorded. You're finished." Sanders, caught red-handed, tried to escape but was quickly subdued by the officers. As they took Sanders away, Alexander ran to Sophie, hugging her tightly. "Are you okay? Did he hurt you?" Sophie shook her head, tears of relief running down her cheeks. "I'm fine. Thank you for trusting me, Alexander." They kissed, ignoring the chaos around them. For a moment, everything seemed perfect, but fate had one last surprise in store for them. As they left the house, an older man approached them. Sophie froze when she saw him. "Dad?" she whispered, incredulous. The man smiled sadly. "Hello, daughter. It's been a long time." Alexander looked between Sophie and the newcomer, confused. "Sophie, what's going on?" Sophie, pale as a ghost, could barely articulate the words. "Alexander, meet my father, Robert Thompson." The world seemed to stop. Alexander looked at his father, then at Sophie, his mind struggling to process this revelation. "What?" he finally managed to say. "But that means..." Robert Thompson nodded gravely. "Yes, son, Sophie is your sister." The silence that followed was deafening. Sophie brought a hand to her belly, the reality of their situation hitting her hard. Alexander staggered, leaning against the wall to keep from falling. How had they come to this point? And what would this revelation mean for their future and that of their unborn child? As the sun set on the horizon, the three Thompsons looked at each other, aware that nothing would ever be the same again. The truth, so long hidden, had finally come to light, bringing with it a new set of challenges and impossible decisions. The silence in the library of the Thompson mansion was overwhelming. Alexander, Sophie, and Robert sat, each lost in their own thoughts, trying to process the bomb that had just exploded in their lives. Finally, Robert spoke, his voice tired and full of remorse. "I suppose I owe you both an explanation." Alexander looked at him, his eyes burning with a mixture of pain and rage. "Yes, you do. How could you hide something like this from us?" Robert sighed deeply. "It was almost 30 years ago I had an affair with Sophie's mother, Maria. When I found out she was pregnant, I panicked. I was already married to your mother, Alexander, and the company was at a critical moment. I made the most cowardly decision of my life. I gave Maria money to disappear and never come back." Sophie, silent tears running down her cheeks, asked, "Did my mother know you were my father?" Robert nodded. "Yes, she knew, but we agreed we would never tell you. We thought it was best for everyone." "Best?" Alexander exploded. "How can it be best to separate a daughter from her father? How can it be best that two siblings that we—" He couldn't finish the sentence, the horror of the situation choking his words. Sophie stood up abruptly, running to the bathroom. The sounds of her sickness reached the library. Muffled, Alexander ran a hand over his face, overwhelmed. "What are we going to do now? Sophie is pregnant with my child. Our child. My God, how could this happen?" Robert looked at them both, the weight of his past decisions crushing him. "I'm so sorry. If I could go back—" "But you can't," Alexander interrupted. "None of us can. We have to deal with this now." The following days were a whirlwind of emotions and difficult decisions. Alexander and Sophie agreed to undergo DNA tests to confirm their kinship, although deep down they both knew the truth. While waiting for the results, they had to face another reality: Sophie's pregnancy. After long discussions and sleepless nights, they made a heartbreaking decision. "I'm going to give the baby up for adoption," Sophie announced one morning, her voice broken but determined. "It's best for everyone." Alexander looked at her, feeling as if his heart was breaking into 1,000 pieces. Despite everything, a part of him yearned to be a father, to raise this child. But he knew Sophie was right. "I'll be with you every step of the way," he promised, taking her hand. "As your brother." The word brother sounded strange on his lips, but they both knew they would have to get used to it. Meanwhile, the Jack Sanders scandal had exploded in the media. Thompson Enterprises stocks initially plummeted, but then began to recover when it became known that the Thompson family had been the victim of an elaborate corporate espionage plan. Robert, determined to make amends for his past mistakes, called a press conference in front of dozens of cameras and journalists. He confessed his past infidelity and publicly acknowledged Sophie as his daughter. "I have made many mistakes in my life," he declared, his voice trembling slightly. "But I am determined to do the right thing from now on. Sophie is my daughter, and she has as much right to the Thompson inheritance as Alexander." The news shook the business world and high society. Rumors and speculations skyrocketed, especially when it became known that the engagement between Alexander and Sophie had been called off. Weeks later, Alexander was in his office, reviewing some documents when someone knocked on the door. "Come in," he said, looking up. To his surprise, it was Emily, his personal assistant for years. "Alexander," she began, visibly nervous. "There's something I need to tell you." He looked at her, intrigued. "What is it, Emily?" She took a deep breath. "I've been in love with you for years. I know it's not the right time with everything that's happened, but I couldn't keep hiding it." Alexander was speechless for a moment. Then slowly a small smile formed on his lips. "Emily, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," she replied quickly. "I just wanted you to know I understand if you need time or if you don't feel the same way." Alexander stood up and approached her. "Thank you for your honesty, Emily. The truth is I've always admired your intelligence and dedication. Perhaps when things calm down a bit, we could have coffee." Emily smiled, her eyes shining with hope. I'd love that. Months passed. Sophie's pregnancy progressed, and with each passing day, the reality of their situation became more palpable. One afternoon, as Sophie rested in the garden, Alexander approached her. I've been thinking, he began, sitting beside her, about the baby. Sophie looked at him expectantly. I know we agreed to give it up for adoption, Alexander continued, but what if we raised it together? As siblings, as family, we could give it all the love and support it needs. Sophie looked at him, surprised. Are you sure? It would be complicated. Alexander nodded. I know, but it's our child. Sophie, despite everything, I love it, and I know you do too. Tears of relief and joy ran down Sophie's cheeks. I've been thinking the same thing. I was afraid to tell you. They hugged, knowing the road ahead would be difficult, but determined to face it together. Time passed and slowly the wounds began to heal. Robert retired from the company, leaving Alexander in charge. Sophie, for her part, decided to study law, determined to help families in complex situations like hers. The day the baby was born, the entire Thompson family was at the hospital. When the nurse brought the little one, wrapped in a blue blanket, everyone held their breath. He's beautiful, Sophie whispered, tears of joy in her eyes. Alexander, holding the baby in his arms, felt a wave of unconditional love. Welcome to the world, little Matthew, he said softly. Robert, observing the scene from a corner, approached timidly. Can I hold him? Sophie and Alexander exchanged a look and nodded. Robert took his grandson in his arms, and for the first time in years he cried openly. I promise you, he said through tears, that I will be the best grandfather this child could wish for. I'll do things right this time. 5 years later. The Thompson mansion was decked out for a celebration. Colorful balloons adorned the garden, and children's laughter filled the air. Uncle Alex, little Matthew shouted, running towards Alexander. Look what Grandpa gave me. Alexander lifted Matthew in his arms, smiling at the sight of the small toy car. Wow, how nice. Did you thank Grandpa? Matthew nodded energetically. Yes, and Mum Sophie says we can have cake later. Cake? You're so lucky. Alexander laughed, putting the boy down. Go play with your friends, champ. As Matthew ran back to the party, Emily approached Alexander, intertwining her fingers with his. He's a wonderful boy, she commented, resting her head on Alexander's shoulder. He is. He nodded, softly kissing his wife's forehead. How are you feeling? Emily caressed her slightly swollen belly. Good, although our little one won't stop moving. Alexander smiled, placing his hand over. Emily's just as restless as his father. On the other side of the garden, Sophie observed the scene with a smile. Her boyfriend, a young lawyer she had met in law school, approached her. Everything okay? He asked, offering her a glass of juice. Sophie nodded, taking the glass. Everything's perfect. Look at Matthew. Carlos, isn't he the happiest child in the world? Carlos followed her gaze, smiling as he saw the little boy laughing with his friends. He is, and he has the most extraordinary family I've ever known. Sophie looked at him, love shining in her eyes. Thank you for understanding our particular situation. Not many would. Hey, said Carlos, taking her hand. Love comes in many forms, and this family has love to spare. At that moment, Robert approached them, Matthew riding on his shoulders. Who wants cake? The grandfather asked, his eyes shining with joy. A chorus of me rose from all corners of the garden. As the family gathered around the cake table, Alexander looked around. His wife, his sister, his father, his son, nephew, friends, and loved ones. 5 years ago, he never would have imagined his life would take this turn, but now, surrounded by so much love and happiness, he wouldn't change it for anything in the world. Sophie caught his gaze and smiled at him, a smile that spoke of forgiveness, of healing, of a bright future. And as Matthew blew out the candles on his birthday cake, Alexander knew that despite all the obstacles and pain, they had found their happy ending. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't conventional, but it was theirs. And it was beautiful.